Alright everyone, tonight we're setting aside the heavy thoughts and going for something a bit greasier. Medieval snack food. Even in an age with no burger joints, no vending machines, and not a single hot dog vendor, people still found ways to munch between meals. Some of it was tasty, some of it was unsettling, but all of it was very much of its time. Before you get too comfortable, go ahead and give the video a like, and subscribe if you truly enjoy what I make here. And please drop a note in the comments to let me know where you're watching from and what time of day or night it is for you. I always enjoy seeing the wide mix of places and hours people tune in from. Now lower the lights, maybe let a fan run for that quiet hum in the background, and let's step slowly into tonight's topic. In an era when most little bites looked suspicious and often tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare triumph. Sweet, piping hot, and just the right amount of risky, they summed up medieval decision-making rather well. Golden and round, they were the nearest thing you'd find to a donut though, without icing and definitely without health standards. So what exactly did people use to make one of these treats? Apples, of course, though not the glossy supermarket kind we imagine today. Think small, tart, oddly shaped fruit that might have come from a scraggly tree behind a tavern or perhaps from a neighbor's orchard without permission. These were chopped up and dropped into a rough mixture of flour, eggs, and occasionally ale. Water wasn't always safe, and ale made the world seem a little brighter. Then came the frying. Deep frying in the 14th century was a whole performance. The fat, most often pork lard, was reused long past the point of decency. It contributed flavour, though flavour might be a polite word here. Still, the end product was something crisp, hot, and strangely addictive. Straight from the pan, a fritter was joy itself. Crisp edges, soft interior, and always the chance of a painful burn. If you had money, you might see yours sprinkled with imported sugar, a sweet luxury and a way of showing off. More commonly, a drizzle of honey or a spiced syrup sufficed. Either way, it was sweet enough to distract from the rest of your diet, which often involved cabbage, pretending it was something else entirely. These fritters were a kind of street snack. You could grab one after church at the fair or wandering the market. They appealed to children, adults, and even opportunistic birds. They were warm, quick, and indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled vegetables that awaited at home. Of course, sometimes they were overdone, the apples too sour or the batter oddly rubbery. But when they came out right, they were wonderful. A single bite could almost make you forgive medieval life for being medieval. If fritters were the donut of that world, then cheese curds were something like their popcorn. Small, squeaky, and never entirely predictable. They didn't melt, they didn't stretch, and they weren't trying to impress anyone. That was the charm. Remember, medieval cheese wasn't aiming for perfection on a plate. It was made quickly, eaten quickly, and expected to survive travel-poor storage and possibly being stepped on by livestock. Curds were the earliest stage of cheese, the fresh little lumps produced before the rest hardened into something sturdy enough to double as a building block. They came about in the process of separating milk into curds and whey done with rennet. That sounds refined, until you remember rennet came from the stomach lining of a young animal. Regardless, it worked. The curds were lightly pressed, salted, and there you had it. Sometimes soft, sometimes rubbery, sometimes squeaking between your teeth, but always filling, easy to carry, and oddly pleasing. In a time when a snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, these curds were a victory. Monks liked them, travelers carried them, and children gobbled them like treats, assuming the cows had been generous that week. You could fry them, sprinkle them over stews, or simply eat them by the handful while smelling faintly of the barn. Unlike many foods of the Middle Ages, cheese curds weren't set aside for holy days or feasts. They were everyday fare, steady, familiar, gently chewy, the sort of companion that never tries too hard but is always there when needed. Did they sometimes taste a bit off? Naturally. Freshness wasn't absolute in those days, but with enough salt and a bit of optimism, most people kept eating. With no cold storage to rely on your sense of what was acceptable adapted. No, they weren't elegant, but they were solid, comforting, and satisfying enough to be considered a small luxury. In a pinch, they could also be used to tempt cats or bargain with children. Turnips, however, were never dessert material. But in an age where sugar was rare, apples weren't year-round, and desperation often passed for creativity, someone looked at a turnip and asked, "What if this could be pie?" And thus turnip pie appeared. To be fair, it wasn't always dreadful. Sometimes it bordered on pleasant. Mashed turnips, ideally soft, mixed with egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit. If the cook was feeling generous, then wrapped in a simple crust made with flour, water, and determination. The result was edible, occasionally comforting, though sometimes it did taste more like animal feed baked in pastry. These pies stuck around for two main reasons. Turnips were cheap and pastry covered a multitude of mistakes. Overripe, bitter, underdone, it didn't matter as much once wrapped in dough and drizzled with honey. It wasn't cheesecake, but it made the effort, and effort mattered. You might find these at markets, on feast tables, and in monasteries with too many vegetables and too few ideas. Some versions included spices, nutmeg if the monks were wealthy, pepper if the cook felt mischievous. Occasionally raisins were thrown in, which mostly puzzled everyone. The wealthy didn't bother with turnip pies, except perhaps to make a show of mixing with commoners. But for ordinary people this counted as dessert, or at least something like it. Despite its shaky logic, the turnip pie lasted. People ate it, or at least not enough disliked it to make it vanish. It was inexpensive, hearty, faintly sweet, and by medieval standards almost remarkable. If there was one dish that truly earned the title of comfort food in that world, it was the meat pasty, a folded pastry filled with seasoned meat baked until brown or burned. Imagine a medieval hot pocket, though, with no microwave and a genuine sense of uncertainty. The strength of the pasty was in its portability. You could eat it while traveling in the fields or even at a grim public event. The thick crust kept the filling safe from dirt pests and the odd sneeze. As for the filling, meat was a very flexible word. Near a hunting estate, you might enjoy pork, mutton, or venison. Otherwise, possibilities widened quickly. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, even hedgehog. Anything that moved could be chopped, seasoned, and tucked away in pastry. Spices such as pepper, sage, or garlic could help disguise the age of the meat, though they couldn't quite erase it. Still, compared with the usual lunch of bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt rich. There were vegetarian versions too, filled with vegetables or cheese, especially for fast days. But the meaty ones were most beloved. Hot, greasy, and filling, you ate first and asked no questions later. Miners and workers sometimes marked their pasties with initials to keep them safe, and some crusts were intentionally made thick at one edge, so they could be held with dirty hands, then discarded or fed to rodents and perhaps spirits. Were they good often enough? Were they a gamble always? That was part of their appeal. In a life where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine, you accepted risks if the food was warm. For freshening the breath, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing available. Small, sugary, herbal, and hard enough to test your teeth, they served as a treat, a digestive, and a makeshift mint all in one. Each seed was coated in sugar, which required serious effort in that time, importing, boiling, pounding, and shaping by hand. Clearly someone believed these tiny morsels deserved the work. They were especially common in noble houses, often offered after meals to cover the lingering taste of heavy meats. Fennel brought a strong licorice-like flavor. Some people liked it, others swallowed quickly and pretended. The sugar helped, but the sharp herbal edge remained, leaving you both refined and slightly puzzled. These seeds also carried a reputation for aiding digestion, particularly useful after feasts heavy with meat and mead. Think of them as a mix between breath mints and antacids, though, with a real risk of chipping a tooth. You tested one cautiously, listened for cracking, and then committed. A small risk every time. The wealthy enjoyed them freely, while ordinary folk might taste cheaper imitations made with honey and herbs. Not the same, but close enough. They didn't fill the belly, but they freshened the mouth and gave a little air of refinement, even if you still wore mud on your boots. And finally, if medieval sweets had a shining star, it was the honey cake. Dense, sticky, and unforgettable. These cakes were what bakers made when sugar was scarce, and honey was the sweetener for those brave enough to keep bees. Flour, water, and generous helpings of honey made a chewy, sturdy cake. Sometimes it was lovely. Sometimes it could double as a doorstop depending on how long it sat by the fire. Spices like nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon made it more impressive enough to set the village talking for days. Dried fruits might also appear if they hadn't been stolen by children or turned into drink. Honey cakes appeared at feasts, festivals, and weddings. One of the reasons honey cakes were so beloved was their resilience. They could be baked ahead of time, stored for days, and survive accidents without much harm. Dropped to the ground, stepped on, even tossed across a hall in a half-hearted food fight, they held their shape. They weren't only eaten, they were given as presents, offered as bribes, and sometimes handed over as thinly veiled insults. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your attitude. These were not delicate creations. Many resembled dense blocks more than dainty desserts. Cutting one required a sharp knife and the quiet hope no one would watch you struggle. Eating them, however, was simpler. They weren't soft, they weren't fluffy, but they were sturdy, sticky, and designed for the roughness of medieval life. Coated in honey that clung to your fingers like you had just lost a skirmish with a hive, they still satisfied. They carried the taste of warmth and richness, a small pause from chewing salted grain or chasing vermin out of storage. Sweet, chewy, and heavy enough to double as light exercise for your jaw, they offered real pleasure. Then came fried fish skin cracklings, perhaps the most surprising delight from a time that also championed eel pie. These crisp, salty slivers were never intended as a delicacy, but they made sense. In a culture that wasted nothing, fish skin became snack food almost by accident. Likely, some thrifty cook faced a heap of discarded skins and decided to toss them in hot fat. In an instant, something edible, even enjoyable, appeared. Fish were everywhere in coastal towns and riverside villages. After the meat went into stews and the heads were fed to the cats, the skin was dropped into boiling lard until it curled and hardened. The result was thin and crunchy like a dried leaf, but tasting of concentrated sea. Salt improved it, garlic or herbs elevated it, and suddenly it was not just practical but almost refined. These strips were light, durable, rich in fat, and exactly what tired labourers needed after long days in the fields or on guard duty. They travelled well. Soldiers carried them. Sailors depended on them. Vendors sold them outside alehouses for a few coins, feeding drunk patrons with something louder than their songs. Were there scales left behind? Sometimes. Did they curl into strange shapes? Yes. But compared to much of the fare available, they were elegant, crispy, and far less likely to make you ill. The only drawback was the smell. Frying fish skin indoors meant your home reeked of the ocean for days. Still, taste forgave everything. When bread grew stale and beer went flat, people didn't waste. They invented bread soaked in ale. Known as sops or trench toast, it was comfort food at its most humble. Imagine French toast stripped of eggs, sugar, and cinnamon, leaving behind only the soaked bread. Yesterday's loaf, hard as wood, was dropped into ale until it softened. Not the kind of ale with notes of fruit or hops. This was the flat, low-strength brew made in smoky back rooms with the hygiene of a henhouse. The bread swelled, softened, and became chewable again. In the right mood, it wasn't bad. Warm, bready, with the faint bitterness of fermented grain, it at least didn't offend. This snack was favoured by the working-class people without time or utensils, but who needed easy calories. It was filling fast and messy enough to feel like a reward. Some cooks added herbs, cheese, or a fried egg if the hen had been generous that day. On special occasions, the bread might be soaked in spiced ale with a shaving of nutmeg for flair. Like many medieval meals, it stretched ingredients. Stale bread became edible. Beer that was turning was disguised as intentional. The one weakness, it didn't travel. Once soaked bread turned into a sloppy cube of porridge, best eaten quickly by the fire before it collapsed entirely. For those higher on the social ladder, there were sops in wine. Take bread, toast it if possible, and soak it in warmed, sweetened wine. Richly spiced, often mulled. This was served as a soft dish, eaten with spoons while musicians played. Nobles considered it refined. Others quietly suspected it was laziness disguised as elegance. It appeared at banquets and late-night meals, a way to linger at the table without talking politics. When prepared carefully, it was rich and comforting, the wine, adding depth, the spices creating the illusion of sophistication. When done poorly, it was simply soggy bread in a bowl. Additions ranged from dried fruit and nuts to cheese or even eggs, transforming it from snack to culinary puzzle. Commoners had their own versions with sour wine or ale, less dessert and more survival food. Yet sops in wine endured because they were filling, warming, and carried a faint trace of luxury, even if they mostly tasted like spiced regret. Among prized sweets were dried fruits, raisins, figs, dates, and the occasional imported prune. They lasted for months, sometimes years, and survived long journeys. This wasn't trail mix in a tidy pouch. These were tough, chewy relics of last harvest, shriveled and dense. Sweet, yes, sugar concentrated until every bite was like candy. Nobles cherished them, monks stashed them, children hoarded them as treasures. But chewing them was hard labor. Figs carried seeds that scratched like rough floss. Dates glued your molars together. Raisins lingered in your teeth for hours. Eating them quietly was impossible. Still, they flavored pies, porridge, and honey cakes, or were soaked in wine to impress guests. Wealthy households wrapped them in pastry or sprinkled them with rosewater. For commoners, dried fruit was rare, appearing at weddings, holidays, or special feasts. When it did, it was eaten reverently, sometimes in hiding to avoid sharing. Stored in cloth sacks or pots, they hardened over time, becoming even more difficult to chew or useful as makeshift missiles among siblings. Sweet, precious, and occasionally painful dried fruit left its mark. For something heartier, there were blood pudding balls. Small, dark spheres made of animal blood, oats, onions, fat, and spices. Nothing went to waste. Blood was mixed with grain until it formed a sticky porridge, then shaped into balls and fried in hot fat until the outside crisped. The result was heavy, iron-rich, and unmistakably strong in flavor. Best eaten hot, though sometimes consumed cold if hunger outweighed squeamishness. The wealthy might season them with pepper or serve them alongside eggs and ale. Peasants were content just to have something besides boiled greens. These were not dainty. 2 would fill you enough to skip a meal. 4 were a test of strength or appetite. Sold at fairs and roadside stalls, they were particularly popular in winter, warming body and spirit in equal measure. Some disliked the texture or the very idea of eating blood, but in a world where survival mattered, most practicality won. They were nourishing, portable, and undeniably memorable. Finally, pancakes. Forget the tall, fluffy stacks of today. Medieval pancakes were thin, chewy, and fried in lard until the edges crisped. The batter was simple flour, eggs, and liquid, often ale. Ladled onto an iron griddle, they emerged uneven, sometimes charred, sometimes undercooked, occasionally both. But they worked. Flat circles that could be carried on horseback, still edible at journey's end. Flavor varied with what you had. A splash of ale for tang, honey for sweetness, herbs or onions for boldness. Most of the time they were plain fried bread with grease. Served hot, devoured quickly, they were eaten by everyone, peasants, nobles, monks, merchants. Not glamorous, not refined, but democratic, hearty and filling. Some cooks layered pancakes with cheese, others dipped them in broth. Plenty of people simply rolled them up and ate them as they were. Sweet, savory, or burned to an unrecognizable crisp, they still counted. Leftovers could be stacked into makeshift cakes or even joked about as armor. Pancakes found a special place during Lent and other fasting periods when meat was forbidden. They served as a loophole, fried filling, both modest and indulgent at the same time. They were also convenient for hiding other less desirable ingredients inside. They might not have been attractive to look at, but medieval pancakes endured. They didn't need admiration. They only required a hot pan and an empty stomach. Sitting somewhere between a snack and something almost sacred, the wafer appeared. This wafer was thin, crisp, and suspiciously light, balanced right between a sweet treat and a test of your teeth. Wafers could be found everywhere. sold outside churches, offered at fairs, handed out by monks, and sometimes floating in soups like a holy crouton. Let's be clear, these were not the chocolate-coated cream-filled wafers we know today. Medieval wafers consisted of flour, water, eggs, and very little else. If one felt extravagant, a touch of honey or rose water might be added, but most versions kept things plain. The batter was thin, poured onto heated metal irons, then pressed between two searing hot plates, much like an old panini maker. The result looked like it belonged in a religious service, and the taste was something like crunchy paper with ambition. They were popular because they were quick to prepare, easy to carry, and perfect for mass production and sales. Vendors waited outside churches on feast days, offering stacks of warm wafers to congregants leaving Mass. The unspoken message was clear: you could buy now and worry about sin later. The irons often carried decorative patterns: crosses, flowers, saints' faces, depending on the mold and the mood of the baker. The designs added no flavor, but they gave your eyes something to consider while chewing slowly and pretending you weren't underwhelmed. Structurally, wafers were fragile. Look at them too firmly and they cracked. Try to break one evenly and it shattered. Storing them was troublesome. Carrying them was even harder. Eating outdoors became an adventure with crumbs, wind, and frustration. And yet wafers were well loved. They were crisp light and gave the feeling of a small celebration. For the wealthy, wafers were dressed up with fruit or layered with cheese. For ordinary people, they were sold in piles at market stalls and eaten instantly before they crumbled into dust. After wafers came a sweet that bore a sticky name: sucket. The treat was fruit boiled down in syrup until it lost its will to resist, sealed in jars as though taken captive by sweetness. Candied orange, ginger, dates, anything preserved in sugar until it sparkled like jewels. Sweet enough to make your teeth ache, decadent enough to make you ignore your conscience. This was not everyday fare. A peasant gnawing on his 7th onion of the week wasn't going to have sucket. This was the snack of the privileged, offered in noble halls or given as elegant gifts. Sugar was costly, fruit wasn't always in season, so sucket was saved for special days, weddings, royal events, or whenever the rich simply wanted to show off. The process was laborious. Fruit was boiled in syrup or honey, drained, left to dry and boiled again, repeated over and over as though the real battle was against moisture itself. In the end, you had glossy pieces of fruit that were chewy, sweet, and so concentrated they could almost be considered weapons of sugar. Some versions stayed soft, glistening in ornate jars. Others were dried, rolled in sugar, and cut into small cubes like glittering candy. Above all, sucket was a marker of wealth. It demonstrated access to trade routes, sugar, and servants willing to stir endlessly. At banquets, trays of sucket were passed around like edible coins. Guests smiled, accepted one, and regretted not taking more. For the poor, the closest they came was sneaking a lick from a spoon when no one was looking. Was it worth the extravagance? Absolutely. Few medieval sweets truly felt like dessert. Sucket did. And then there was fried eel, the odd finale in the lineup of medieval junk food. Strangely beloved, it crossed the boundaries of class, appearing both on peasant tables and at royal banquets. Eel was everywhere in Europe's waterways. Rivers teemed with them. They were plentiful, easy to catch, cheap to prepare, and when fried, surprisingly good. Slippery when alive, bony when butchered, and unsettling in appearance, they still ended up in the pan by the thousands. Why? Because they tasted good, and more importantly, they weren't turnips. The process was not pleasant. Catching was done at night when they writhed through shallow waters like living ropes. Skinning them was like fighting with a rope that didn't want to be handled. Once subdued, they were chopped, seasoned if you could afford it, and fried in hot fat until the skin turned crisp and the flesh firmed. The finished eel was crunchy on the outside, tender inside, with a rich, slightly oily taste, something like calamari that had wandered into a tavern kitchen and confused itself with chicken. Fried eel appeared everywhere, at fairs, at feasts, in roadside inns. Even more surprising, it was eaten during religious fasting days. Classified not as meat, eel slipped into the loopholes of dietary rules. Monks ate it freely, nobles displayed it proudly, kings had it baked in pies to show off at feasts. Yes, it had bones. Yes, it sometimes twitched after death. But if you could push past that, you discovered a dish genuinely delicious. Crispy, savory, and just greasy enough to feel like mischief on a weekday. It might seem strange to us now, but back then it was prized. A slippery delicacy that filled stomachs and kept medieval menus lively. And from medieval food, our story shifts into something older: dreams of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, dreams carried mystery and meaning. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't a private fragment of the mind. It was a divine message, a direct note from the gods to the sleeper. Ignoring it was dangerous, like leaving a ruler's command unread. By around 2500 BCE, they had built a system of dream interpretation inscribed on clay tablets with cuneiform writing. These records were not entertainment. They guided politics, medicine, and religion. Kings delayed wars if troubling dreams foretold danger. Farmers held back from planting if visions suggested poor omens. To them, the world was always speaking, and dreams were its language. Special interpreters known as Baru priests filled the role of advisors, similar to later analysts but with libraries of omen texts instead of couches. Manuals such as the Ishkar Zak listed dreams and their consequences in painstaking detail. Dreams of eating dates promised good fortune. Dreams of losing teeth foretold death in the family. Dreams of intimacy with a goddess could signal divine favor or arrogance. The manuals didn't suggest guesses, they declared outcomes. Dream equals event. Snake meant betrayal. Falling meant legal troubles. It was presented as logic, though divine logic was stranger than human reason. But they didn't stop at interpretation. They also practiced dream incubation. If a ruler sought guidance, he might sleep in a temple following rituals of fasting, cleansing, and prayer. The goal was to prepare the mind and body for a dream touched by the gods. Certain settings and ceremonies were believed to strengthen the connection and lessen the chance of nonsense visions. To Mesopotamians, the dream world was not something random to puzzle over. It was a landscape to tread carefully with reverence, libraries, and ritual. The gods always spoke, you just had to be asleep to hear them. The Egyptians carried a similar reverence. Dreams were not accidents of the night, but sacred messages. They might come from gods, from ancestors, or even from one's spiritual double, the Ka. Each dream carried intention to guide, to warn, to bless, or to unsettle. By the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egyptians began to record their interpretations systematically. One of the most famous is the Ramesside Dream Book, written on papyrus, and found in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina. This was no bedtime diversion. It catalogued hundreds of dreams, each paired with its outcome, favorable or disastrous. The reasoning was not always obvious. For example, if a man dreamt of eating crocodile meat, the interpretation was that he would rise to high office. Odd, yes, but in their cosmology, the crocodile was linked to Sobek, a god of power and authority. To eat its flesh was to take in its strength. Promotion through dream. Each entry began with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by the vision. The interpretations were direct, not vague. They were drawn from centuries of temple knowledge and ritual tradition. Good or bad outcomes were marked in different colored ink. If the dream was bad, the sleeper might burn incense and ask a priest to intervene. Priests of temples dedicated to healing gods such as Sekhmet or Thoth sometimes offered services in dream incubation, where worshippers would spend the night in temple halls seeking visions of guidance or recovery. Purification offerings and sleep in sacred spaces were believed to open a channel for divine communication. This wasn't seen as mere superstition. It was healthcare, religion, and magic combined into one night of rest. Dreams influenced Egyptian medicine too. Amulets might be given to prevent recurring nightmares. Rituals could erase troubling dreams in the same way curses were lifted. For them, sleep was not passive. It was a stage where gods, demons, and ancestors appeared, offering truths that priests could interpret. The unseen world spoke, and only in sleep could it be heard. In Greece, Dreams became more than whispers of the divine. To the ancient Greeks, dreams were more than sleep's idle fancies. They were appointments with the divine. At the heart of this practice lay incubation, the ritual act of lying down to sleep in a sacred space, hoping for a vision that could heal. No god was more closely tied to this tradition than Asclepius, the deity of medicine. His sanctuaries, called Asclepia, dotted the Greek world, stretching from Epidaros to Pergamon. The sick, the anxious, and the desperate flocked there seeking cures. Instead of being given medicine or herbs, they were prescribed sleep approached with reverence, prepared through ritual, and carried out in a sacred chamber. Before anyone entered the abaton, the designated sleeping hall of the temple, they first purified themselves. Bathing, fasting, and sometimes offering a sacrifice prepared both body and spirit. Only then could they lie down on the hard stone beds and wait expectant for the god to come. In the testimonies carved on stone and written in ancient accounts, people reported visions Asclepius touching them with his staff, or sacred snakes gliding across their bodies as they slept. Upon waking, many claimed to be cured, or at the very least to have received divine instructions about treatment. Were these visions genuine? Were they psychosomatic? Or did the faith itself act as a powerful placebo? Whatever the mechanism, the effects were undeniable. Even Hippocrates, the father of rational medicine, acknowledged dreams as valuable for diagnosis. He did not dismiss them as nonsense. Instead, he considered them to be reflections of the body's condition. A dream of flowing water might point toward kidney problems. A dream of suffocation could reveal a chest illness. In Hippocratic writings, dreams were divided into two main groups: natural dreams caused by digestion, emotions, or imbalance, and divine dreams thought to be direct communications from the gods or the cosmos. Yet the interpreters were not limited to physicians in temples. In public squares, professional dream readers, the Wanirokratai, made their trade. With books of omens, rehearsed knowledge, and a good deal of flair, they translated dream imagery into advice. The most famous guide of all was the Onera Critica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a text studied long after. For the Greeks, dreams served as bridges between mortal and divine, between body and soul, between sickness and healing. If fortune smiled, one woke not only healthier, but perhaps with a snake curled peacefully at the foot of the bed, a sign of Asclepius's presence. Across the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than any other: the prophetic dream. These were not simple symbols or private worries. They were seen as revelations, warnings, and instructions sent from realms higher than the human mind. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams became sacred transmissions, direct links to fate, the gods, or the mysterious workings of the universe itself. In the Hebrew tradition, such dreams were central. The Old Testament is filled with examples. Joseph, son of Jacob, dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing to his own, a vision of his eventual rise. Later, interpreting Pharaoh's troubling dreams, he foresaw 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. That interpretation reshaped the policy of Egypt itself. Joseph was not simply a dreamer. He became a national strategist through his ability to read them. In Mesopotamia, kings too looked to their dreams. The Assyrian ruler Ashurbanipal claimed to have seen the gods in visions, guiding him in battle and rule. Such dreams confirmed divine legitimacy, a vital assurance in cultures where the line between king and god was often blurred. The Greeks also had words for these distinctions. Dreams born from the subconscious were called enhypnia, but dreams that revealed truth were called oneiroi, aleathinoi. These were considered true visions, not to be taken lightly. Before founding a city, declaring a war, or launching an expedition, leaders often sought confirmation in dreams. In Greek mythology, even the dreams themselves were personified as daimons, the oneiroi, winged messengers of the gods, slipping into the minds of sleepers with their messages. Romans, though often pragmatic, also gave prophetic dreams their due. Augustus was said to have seen his glory foretold in sleep. Nero consulted interpreters as well, though his fate suggests he did not listen enough. Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, was reported to have seen his victory in a dream where the spirits of his ancestors revealed his triumph in advance. In all of these cultures, prophetic dreams were never mere curiosities. They were tools of governance, evidence of divine favor, and engines of policy. Entire empires shifted course on the basis of a vision seen in the dark. Though Asclepian sanctuaries are best remembered, dream incubation was not unique to Greece. In Anatolia, what is now Turkey, the practice flourished in a mixture of Hittite, Phrygian, and Greco-Roman traditions. Temples and sacred places offered pilgrims the chance to seek divine contact through sleep. One of the most remarkable examples came from the cult of Men, a lunar deity associated with cycles, healing, and naturally with dreams. His sanctuaries were often built high on hillsides facing the moon as though positioned to receive beams of celestial influence. Those who suffered, whether from sickness, doubt, or fear of the future, came to these shrines to lie down in ritual sleep, hoping for a guiding vision. The methods resembled those of the Greek tradition, but with local variations. Worshippers sometimes walked labyrinthine paths or slept beneath carved celestial patterns, believing sacred geometry could channel divine communication. Incense chant and music filled the air, tuning the mind for receptivity. This was not rest. It was sleep as deliberate spiritual practice. Records speak of dream priests who oversaw these rites, guiding visions and offering interpretations afterward. Some even attempted to seed dreams by suggesting certain images before sleep, shaping what might be seen. A hopeful mother-to-be, for instance, might place a fertility idol under her pillow. If she then dreamt of a lion, the priest might declare a strong son was to come. If she dreamt of rain, it might signify a daughter blessed with wisdom and growth. Hittite sources tell of rulers receiving dreams with strategic warnings or instructions, even being told to adopt foreign deities into their temples. Dreams were not only private matters but tools of diplomacy, politics, and ritual obligation. These incubations became communal as well as personal. Pilgrims gathered, forming temporary communities of hope and shared need. They believed that through sleep the gods could reset their lives' directions. In Anatolia, to dream was to participate. Sleep was not escape. It was active engagement in the cosmic order. By the 2nd century CE, dream interpretation had reached a more systematic form, and one man, Artemidorus of Daldis, undertook to catalogue it all. His Onirocritica became the most comprehensive guide to dreams in antiquity. Unlike the mystical scribes who cloaked everything in secrecy, Artemidorus wrote like a scholar and a practical psychologist. His work spanned 5 books filled with thousands of dream accounts, and their meanings collected over years of travel and interviews. He spoke with sailors, soldiers, merchants, courtesans, anyone willing to share their visions. His reasoning was that to know a culture, you must know its dreams. He organized them into categories: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, relationships. Flying could signal freedom or arrogance. Public nudity might mean shame, or for someone of low rank, sudden empowerment. Teeth falling out almost always meant loss, often of relatives, a meaning that curiously endures. What distinguished Artemidorus was his emphasis on context. Earlier dream books offered rigid definitions. He stressed that meaning varied with the dreamer's class, gender, profession, and present circumstances. A rich man's dream of shipwreck spelled financial loss. A poor man's might signal fortune to come. He also addressed symbolism directly. Death in a dream did not always signify death. It could mean renewal. Dreams of intimacy were not always about desire. They could indicate dominance, anxiety, or guilt. His interpretations balanced logical reasoning with imagery that sometimes veered into the surreal, yet his manual endured. For centuries throughout the Roman Empire and later Byzantium, his work guided interpretation. Translated into Arabic, it lived on through medieval scholars, bridging eras long after the temples closed. With Artemidorus, dreams became texts open to study not only for prophecy but for psychological insight. But not all dreams were welcomed. Some were feared as night terrors, visions from restless spirits, demons, or the underworld. These nightmares were not dismissed as mere disturbances of sleep. They were regarded as warnings, punishments, or omens. In Babylonian belief, dreams were classified by origin. If a dream filled the dreamer with dread or sickness, it was thought polluted, sent by harmful forces. Priests were called to counteract them through rituals, burning incense, reciting prayers, wearing protective charms. A dream of being pursued by a demon might be treated by sleeping with an amulet under one's pillow or burning cedar wood to repel evil. The Egyptians too feared dark dreams. They believed certain visions came from malicious spirits or even the restless dead. Protective amulets bearing the Eye of Horus or the cheerful dwarf god Bes were worn to guard against such attacks. Spells to erase bad dreams were spoken upon, waking the words themselves, acting as a safeguard to cancel the curse before it entered waking life. For the Greeks, nightmares were often linked to chthonic deities, the gods beneath the earth. Hades, Persephone, or the Erinyes could intrude into dreams to show displeasure or demand justice. Ignoring such warnings was perilous. Plato in his Republic described dreams as battlefields of the soul, where base instincts surged when reason slept. A nightmare, then, was not just divine punishment, but a mirror of imbalance within the self. Romans, pragmatic yet cautious, also dreaded certain dream symbols. To dream of owls, snakes, or wolves might be seen as an omen of death, treachery, or conflict. They too believed that the dead could appear in sleep, sometimes warning, sometimes accusing. Across every culture, nightmares served as cosmic red flags, reminders that human life was tethered to invisible forces and that even sleep offered no escape from destiny. Dreams were not only spiritual experiences, they were instruments of politics. Leaders, priests, and generals used them to justify choices, sway crowds, and secure authority. If the gods spoke in sleep, rulers wasted no time in claiming those words as their own. Alexander the Great is a prime example. Before conquering Egypt, he dreamt of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. Upon arrival at the Oracle of Siwa, priests confirmed the dream. Whether staged or not, it didn't matter. It strengthened his claim to divine descent, bolstering his rule and inspiring his men. Dreams became especially powerful during transitions or crises. They provided legitimacy when the future was uncertain. In Rome, even emperors claimed the authority of dreams. Augustus himself said he had seen a vision of triumph at Actium, the decisive battle against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. When he did win, that dream was enshrined in poems, monuments, and even coins, transforming a private vision into a sacred story. Later, rulers followed his lead. After all, if your dreams bore the approval of the gods who would dare argue with your policies, priests and oracles often leaned into this practice. Dream interpretation became a theological instrument most powerful when it supported the goals of a ruler or the interests of the temple elite. If a provincial governor envisioned disaster, a priest might pronounce it as punishment from heaven for rebellion. On the other hand, dreams of prosperity or victory could be presented as divine encouragement to wage war, raise taxes, or implement sweeping reforms. This tactic was not confined to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt used it as well. Her temple inscriptions describe how her birth was predicted in a dream when the god Amun appeared to her mother and announced she would one day rule. By framing her reign as divinely foretold, she solidified her authority in a throne dominated by men. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets often did the opposite, using dream interpretation to confront rulers. Daniel, for example, explained Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a colossal statue predicting the rise and fall of empires. These visions were not simple bedtime musings. They were allegories wrapped in geopolitics. Across civilizations, dreams allowed leaders to declare, "This is not merely my decision, it is the will of the heaven." Whether they were genuine revelations or carefully crafted propaganda, dreams functioned as a kind of currency, turning the subconscious into state policy. One vision could legitimize an empire. Though the ancient sanctuaries have long since crumbled and the priests of dream have gone to their own rest, the legacy of this tradition remains. The frameworks established in antiquity echo across centuries, whispering through science, psychology, and culture. Much of how we think about dreams today, the idea of symbols, repeated patterns, or messages hidden in the mind, can be traced back to those early attempts to interpret the sleeping world. In the medieval era, these traditions were carried forward. Islamic scholars translated Artemidorus's Honora Critica into Arabic, expanding and refining it. Within Islamic mysticism, dreams became highly respected, regarded as direct avenues of divine guidance. Meanwhile, in Christian Europe, monks and theologians compiled visions of saints and martyrs. These dream accounts often foreshadowed miracles or divine judgment. The structure remained consistent: sleep as sacred passage, dreams as coded messages, and interpreters as the mediators between human beings and the divine. By the 19th century, new voices joined the conversation. Sigmund Freud rejected religious readings, yet leaned heavily on the same symbolic structure that had been used for thousands of years. In his interpretation of Dreams 1899, Freud argued that dreams were expressions of repressed desires and fears. He dismissed the gods but still relied on metaphor, symbol, and narrative, just as earlier interpreters had done. His student Carl Jung pushed the theory further, proposing that dreams contained archetypes: the shadow, the wise old man, the hero. These universal figures bore a striking resemblance to the mythic characters found in Greek temples or Babylonian omen lists. Even modern neuroscience, though stripped of mysticism, acknowledges complexity. The study of REM sleep, lucid dreaming, trauma, and memory still reflects ancient assumptions that the body and mind reveal themselves in sleep. Pop culture continues the fascination. From horror films based on sleep paralysis to literature steeped in dream symbolism to smartphone apps promising self-discovery through dream journaling, the idea persists. What we see in sleep still matters. The ancients may not have had sleep laboratories or brain scans, but they grasped something. Enduring dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, fragments of the self, or whispers from forces unseen. Whether we call them messages from gods, archetypes of the unconscious, or neural firings, the essential question endures. What is your dream trying to say? From the quiet temples of antiquity, the narrative now leaps forward in time to the restless United States of the mid-19th century. By 1860, the nation was stretched nearly to breaking. California had been a state for 10 years, but often felt like a distant cousin rather than part of the family. The eastern half thrummed with cities, factories, and railroads, while the far west remained wild, scattered, and frustratingly disconnected. A letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks longer if weather, illness, or bandits intervened. And that was only if it arrived at all. Mail routes were slow and chaotic. The most common path sent ships down the Atlantic, across the narrow Isthmus of Panama, and up the Pacific. The trip was plagued by delays, tropical fevers, and endless logistical snarls. The overland alternative by stagecoach was hardly better: slow, treacherous, and hampered by swamps of mud, mountain passes blocked by snow, or raids along the route. The lag was more than a nuisance. It was a political crisis. Washington feared that California, isolated and drifting, might weaken in loyalty. With secession already looming, keeping the Union stitched together by communication was urgent. Into this void stepped visionaries, none more daring than those who proposed a central relay system using the one resource the American frontier had in abundance: open land and strong horses. Skilled riders moving in shifts and swapping out mounts at stations every 10 to 15 miles could in theory carry the mail from Missouri to California in just 10 days. The scheme sounded reckless. The trail would stretch nearly 2,000 miles across plains, deserts, rivers, and barely charted mountain ranges. Riders would face sweltering heat, freezing nights, wild animals, ambushes, and sheer exhaustion. But if it worked, it would shrink the continent and tie the coasts together faster than ever. The country's growth was outpacing its infrastructure. America was expanding beyond its means. With a mix of desperation, ambition, and frontier grit, one audacious plan galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. Thus, the Pony Express was conceived. It was not a government creation, but the idea of three bold businessmen, William H. Russell Alexander Majors and William B. Waddell. All three were partners in a freight and stagecoach company already familiar with the hazards of moving goods across the frontier. But in 1860 they turned to an even more ambitious goal, accelerating mail service to California. For Russell, the stakes were personal. His reputation was in ruins from failed ventures and financial scandal. He saw the Pony Express as his chance for redemption, a patriotic service that could restore his name and win favor with the federal government. If the system succeeded, they hoped it would lead to a lucrative federal mail contract. Majors was the organizer, a devout man known for discipline. He demanded strict conduct from employees, even requiring oaths against drinking and swearing. He built the express like a military campaign. Relay stations every 10 to 15 miles, home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and a system kept running with absolute order. Waddell, the quieter partner, provided the financial and legal backbone, keeping the enterprise afloat while the others drove it forward. Together they invested heavily. More than 400 horses were purchased. Over 80 riders were hired. Nearly 190 stations were built in the most isolated terrain of the West. It was a gamble of staggering scale, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet without any federal funding, they launched it themselves. Bold to the point of reckless but deeply emblematic of American determination. By April 1860, the Pony Express was ready. The route itself was a fragile bridge stretched across the continent. From St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, nearly 2,000 miles of plains, deserts, and mountain passes. To keep pace, they built roughly 190 relay stations spaced so that a horse could run flat out for 10 to 15 miles before tiring. At intervals of 75 to 100 miles, home stations offered food, rest, and fresh riders. Horses were chosen not for looks but endurance and speed. Sleek thoroughbreds sprinted across the prairies in the east. Tough Mustangs carried mail through deserts and mountains in the west. The system was ruthless in its efficiency. Riders leapt from one mount to another in seconds, transferring the mochila, the leather mail pouch, without pause. Some stations were little more than huts of sod or rough shacks. Others were fortified with walls and rifles. Supplies had to be delivered months in advance, grain for horses, food for riders, water where possible. Weather added constant threats: blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in Utah, scorching heat across Nebraska. Rivers swelled, trails collapsed, wild animals prowled. And beyond all that, there were outlaws and the rising conflicts with Native American tribes. And yet, astonishingly, the system worked. With riders switching every 75 to 100 miles and horses swapped every 10 to 15, the mail crossed the continent in only 10 days, a miracle of speed for its time. It was courage and grit woven into a relay of endurance, stitching together a fragile line of connection across the vastness of America. On the 3rd of April 1860, the Pony Express opened. In St. Joseph, Missouri, crowds gathered at Pike's Peak stables, buzzing with anticipation. The first rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though the record is debated, mounted his horse, seized the mochila, and thundered westward. Cannons fired, cheers rang out, and in that moment the continent felt just a little smaller. A new chapter of American history began, carried forward on pounding hooves. The mail pouch, carried by Johnny Fry on that first ride, weighed around 20 pounds. Inside were letters, newspapers, and telegrams bound for California. One message had already traveled by telegraph from Washington, D.C., and was now continuing the rest of the journey on horseback, a symbolic marriage of new technology and sheer physical endurance. At the same moment in Sacramento, a rider set off eastward, beginning the return leg. Between them lay nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 relay stations, and some of the harshest landscapes in North America, and the plan was to conquer it all in just 10 days. Each rider along the route bore the mochila, the specially designed leather mail saddlebag, from one station to the next. The exchanges were lightning fast. A rider would swing down, slide the mochila from one horse to another, and leap back into the saddle in less than 2 minutes. The design was ingenious. With 4 locked pouches fitted over the saddle horn, it could be transferred without loosening straps or wasting time. In this system, speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, no matter the hour, no matter the weather, through rainstorms, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the danger, the very first run succeeded. The letters from Missouri arrived in Sacramento in 9 days, and 23 hours a triumph. Newspapers across the nation hailed the achievement as nothing short of miraculous. In that moment, the legend of the Pony Express was born. Though only a handful of letters had been carried in that first mochila, the symbolism mattered more than the contents. It was proof that the continent could be bound together by determination, that man and horse could race faster than isolation. For the riders, it was the beginning of an extraordinary and perilous chapter. For the nation, it was the first taste of near-instant communication, something thought impossible only months before. The vast West suddenly felt smaller. But the true heartbeat of the Pony Express wasn't the horses, the stations, or even the leather mochila. It was the riders themselves. They were young, wiry figures who risked everything to keep the line alive. These were not ordinary couriers. They were teenagers stepping into legend. The average Pony Express rider was often no older than 18, with some as young as 16. Most weighed under 125 pounds to spare the horses unnecessary burden. Speed and endurance mattered more than anything. The famous recruitment notice, whether real or exaggerated, summed up the spirit. Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Even if the exact words were apocryphal, the sentiment was accurate. Riders covered 75 to 100 miles in a shift, changing horses at each station, refusing rest until the mochila had been passed to the next courier. They often rode through darkness, through blizzards, summer heat, or sudden storms. Though they carried pistols or rifles, their best defense against ambush was speed. Many traveled unarmed, relying solely on their ability to outrun threats. A few became famous for their daring. Pony Bob Haslam, for example, once covered 380 miles in less than 2 days during the Paiute conflict, even after being struck by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody later claimed he had ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians continue to doubt his tale. The truth hardly needed embellishment. Riders traversed mountains, deserts, and valleys where a single mistake could mean freezing to death, drowning, or disappearing forever. Yet despite these dangers, the service delivered with astonishing reliability. In its entire run, only a single mochila was ever lost. The risks were extreme, but the rewards for these young men were considerable. A rider could earn between $100 and $150 a month, a generous wage for the time, especially for someone barely out of adolescence. Beyond the money, they reveled in the speed, the daring, and the sense of purpose. They weren't simply transporting letters, they were weaving the nation together, one gallop at a time. In those 18 months, the riders of the Pony Express became symbols of endurance, courage, and relentless willpower. Yet each ride was a gamble with death. The hazards were constant. Nature itself was a relentless adversary. Riders endured snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, scorching heat across the Nevada desert, and violent thunderstorms that could turn a river crossing into a death trap. Falling into icy water risked hypothermia. A stumble in a swollen river could be fatal. Wolves prowled at night, rattlesnakes lurked in the brush, and mountain lions shadowed the trails. Even so, animals were not the greatest threat. Men were. Bandits and bushwhackers knew that a rider's mochila might contain valuables, letters lined with money orders, or even dusted with gold. Riders carried revolvers, but they were outnumbered more often than not. To stop meant to risk life and mission. During the brief life of the Express, violence also erupted from larger conflicts. The Paiute War of 1860, fueled by anger over land seizures and broken promises, led to deadly attacks on stations. Riders were ambushed, keepers killed, and several posts reduced to ashes. In one of the most famous episodes, Pony Bob Haslam rode nearly 190 miles through hostile territory, wounded but undeterred, carrying the mail regardless. Even when human dangers were absent, loneliness was its own enemy. Riders spent hours utterly alone with only a horse and the open dark. An accident, a broken limb, or an exhausted mount could mean dying unseen in the wilderness. Still they pressed on. Mail was delayed at times but almost never lost. Riders were injured but very few were killed. In just a year and a half of operation, the Pony Express carved itself into American memory, not as a fantasy but as a grueling, terrifying and inspiring reality. For all its hardship, the impact of the Pony Express was immediate and enormous. In a country on the brink of civil war, the Express demonstrated that distance no longer dictated destiny. Before it, letters between the East and California took weeks to arrive. By the Express, messages crossed in just 10 days. Suddenly, California was not so far away. Newspapers could print news almost in real time. Businesses could make decisions with speed. Families felt closer, less isolated. And politically, the Union felt more tightly bound, just when unity mattered most. President James Buchanan received regular reports from California during the tense months before Abraham Lincoln's election. Thanks to the Express, it reassured Washington that the West remained connected within reach. The Express also laid the groundwork for the next steps of infrastructure. Its stations scattered across wild country later became waypoints for railroads, stagecoaches, and eventually telegraph lines. What began as an improvised network of huts and barns became the blueprint for a continent's communication system. Culturally, the Pony Express became a symbol even before it disappeared. Newspapers romanticized the riders. Young men dreamed of galloping across the plains with a mailbag heavy with destiny. The imagery of courage, risk, and speed captured the nation's imagination. Though it lasted barely a year and a half, the Express became part of American myth. It was more than mail. It was a vision of what the frontier spirit could accomplish. It stitched together the dream of a united country, proving that possibility itself could ride on horseback. But the service was doomed almost from the beginning, not because it failed, but because technology moved faster. Even as the Express thundered to life in April 1860, construction began on the transcontinental telegraph. With wires stretching west from Missouri and east from California, the days of horse-bound communication were numbered. Nothing on four legs could ever compete with a message carried by electricity. By the 24th of October 1861, just 18 months after that first triumphant ride, the final telegraph line was connected. The system went live, and for the first time, the United States had instantaneous communication from coast to coast. That very same day, the Pony Express made its last delivery. The sound of galloping hooves gave way to the sharp clicks of Morse code. Even before the telegraph, the business had been bleeding money. Russell, Majors and Waddell had invested more than $700,000 and recovered only a fraction. With no federal subsidy and enormous expenses, horses, riders, stations, supplies, the operation could never be profitable. It was always more proof of concept than sustainable business. Russell's financial scandals only deepened the problems, and the company began collapsing even before the wires were finished. But its ending was not mournful. The very point of the Pony Express had been to show what was possible, and in that it succeeded. It proved rapid communication across the continent was not fantasy. Riders moved on to other jobs, stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the telegraph took its place. The fall of the Express was not failure but transition. The horse gave way to the wire, as the wire would one day yield to radio satellites and the internet. Yet for those 18 months, America paused in awe. Teenage riders, lean horses and leather pouches conquered time and space, if only briefly. The Pony Express remains a legend not because it endured, but because it proved that even the widest frontier could be bridged with courage, grit, and the pounding of hooves across the open land. In an age when the world seemed to worship speed and progress, one daring experiment thundered across the American frontier and etched itself into history. The Pony Express, though it existed for barely a year and a half, became one of the most legendary enterprises of the 19th century. It lasted only 18 months, yet the memory of its riders galloping across plains and deserts remains stronger than steel telegraph wires or iron tracks. Business-wise, it was a costly, precarious gamble, but in the imagination of Americans it transformed into a national epic. The Express came to embody something far greater than mail delivery. It symbolized courage, relentless determination, and the raw energy of the expanding frontier. Stories spread quickly, aided by dime novels and later by Hollywood, which depicted lone riders silhouetted against vast sunsets racing at breakneck speed with a leather satchel slung across their shoulders and a revolver at their side. Such images resonated deeply with a young nation eager for tales of daring. The Pony Express became not only nostalgia, but a metaphor for American identity itself, proof that through sacrifice and endurance the nation could overcome impossible odds. Names of actual riders such as Pony Bob Haslam and the ever-charismatic Buffalo Bill Cody were elevated to mythic status. Whether Cody truly rode for the Express or not mattered little, he seized the legend, weaving it into his traveling Wild West shows. Their millions of spectators worldwide learned to associate the teenage courier on horseback with heroism and grit. That image outlived the enterprise, standing as shorthand for all the virtues Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer forebears. Over time, physical monuments rose to honor the service. Bronze statues of riders in full gallop now mark cities along the original trail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Modern highways and biking paths follow portions of the same route once carved by horse hooves. Museums, reenactments, and guided tours keep the romance alive. Even the United States Postal Service has issued commemorative stamps treating the Pony Express as a foundational chapter in the nation's postal story. Yet the deeper reason the tale endures lies beyond stone statues or printed stamps. The Pony Express reminds us of an era when human stamina contended with harsh landscapes, when communication required riders to brave blizzards, deserts, and danger. Speed was measured not in satellites or fiber optics, but in pounding hooves, pounding hearts, and raw willpower. Each rider carried not just letters, but the weight of connection across an immense continent. That willingness to ride through darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream became the true essence of the legend. Today, in an age of instant messaging, it is easy to overlook how treacherous communication once was. But the Express stands as a tribute to those who refused to let distance or peril break the bonds of a growing nation. Its greatness lies not in longevity, but in its audacity. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to outrun the impossible. From the pounding hooves of frontier horses, history now shifts to clay pots along the banks of the Tigris. The earliest known beer did not sparkle in glass bottles or frosty mugs. Instead, it foamed inside earthen jars in the middle of Sumerian villages thousands of years ago. Long before Egyptian pyramids rose or Roman legions marched, the Sumerians were perfecting the art of brewing. And in their culture, beer was far more than refreshment. It was sustenance, sacred ritual, and social glue. It is no coincidence that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread, soup, or stew, but for beer. Inscribed on clay tablets around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer while embedding brewing instructions in its verses. Ninkasi was no minor deity. To brew was to invoke her, and to drink was to partake in her blessing. In this way, the Sumerians intertwined daily survival with divine devotion. Their brewing technique was both practical and poetic. They began by baking a special barley bread called bapir, often flavored with honey or dates. This bread was broken up, soaked in jars of water, and left to ferment naturally. The result bore little resemblance to modern lagers. It was thick, opaque, and mildly alcoholic, closer to a nourishing porridge than a crisp drink, yet it served as a dietary staple. At a time when river water could easily be contaminated, beer offered safety. It carried calories, nutrients, and hydration, making it essential for laborers digging canals, priests overseeing rituals, and kings sitting in their palaces. Payment for workers often came in beer rations, sometimes several liters per day. Socially, it bound people together. Instead of individual mugs, drinkers gathered around large ceramic vats, sipping with reed straws to filter sediment. The act of drinking was communal, symbolic, and sacred. Beer was woven into law codes, religious ceremonies, and agriculture. It was in every sense liquid civilization. As Mesopotamia pioneered brewing's spiritual beginnings, Egypt transformed it into an industry. By the time the Old Kingdom flourished along the Nile, beer was no longer just sacred, it was an institution. Massive breweries were attached to temples and palaces, producing at scales unimaginable in earlier centuries. Religious institutions often supervised brewing, since Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility. It appeared in rituals for Hathor, the goddess of joy and intoxication, as well as in funerary rites for the dead. The Egyptian method echoed Sumerian traditions. Partially baked loaves of barley or emmer wheat were broken, soaked, and fermented with added dates or honey. The outcome was a dense, nutritious drink, sometimes eaten with a spoon. Beer was a daily companion for all classes. Tomb murals depict brewers at work, and countless jars of beer were buried with the deceased, ensuring no soul went thirsty in the afterlife. Without beer, no respectable journey beyond the grave was imaginable. Laborers building temples or pyramids were not enslaved masses but paid workers. Their wages often included beer, sometimes as much as 4 liters a day. Archaeologists describe it as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of an energy drink, fueling workers with calories, hydration, and morale. Brewing remained tied to the state, taxes were assessed in beer production, quality was regulated, and women, particularly priestesses, played important roles in brewing. In Egyptian life, beer was as central as the Nile itself. Across both Mesopotamia and Egypt, beer was understood not simply as a beverage but as communion with the divine. Fermentation was mysterious, seen as a magical transformation of grain into sacred liquid. The hymn to Ninkasi functioned both as prayer and brewing manual, invoking the goddess at each stage. Rituals may have begun with chants, offerings, and invocations before fermentation commenced. The final product was poured in temples, shared with priests, or offered to the gods in libation. Egyptian festivals elevated beer's spiritual role even further. Temples brewed massive quantities for daily offerings. At the Festival of Drunkenness, worshippers reenacted the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction who was pacified by drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. By consuming it, humanity was spared, her wrath a potent reminder that beer was seen as capable of taming divine fury. Such rituals underscored beer's role as a mediator between humans and gods, the living and the dead. Beer's presence in funerary rites was equally essential. Tomb inscriptions list exact amounts of beer among offerings to sustain souls in eternity. Seasonal festivals also featured communal drinking, not for idle pleasure, but as symbolic acts binding people to the cosmos. Even later civilizations such as the Hittites or Hebrews retained beer's association with fertility, the earth, and the working classes, while elites shifted toward wine. But beer's importance was not only spiritual or social, it may have been foundational to civilization itself. Increasing numbers of historians argue that the human desire for beer helped spur the very invention of agriculture. While bread certainly mattered, it was the possibility of fermentation that may have driven early people to settle, cultivate barley, and store surplus grain. If so, beer was not merely a product of civilization, but a reason for its birth. In Mesopotamia, where farming first took root, barley's fermentable sugars made it invaluable. Beer provided safe hydration in arid lands where water could be unreliable. Brewing required organization, vessels, tools, timing, and temperature, which in turn encouraged technological innovation and record keeping. Clay tablets reveal that brewers understood fermentation well enough to repeat the process consistently even without modern instruments. Breweries soon became embedded in temple and state economies. Rations of beer fed workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Taxes were collected in grain or beer. The need for measurement and distribution advanced bureaucracy and standardized systems. Beer also moved across borders carried in pottery jars along trade routes linking Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. In this way, beer encouraged commerce, cultural exchange, and the spread of agricultural practices. In the end, beer was more than froth in a jar. It was sustenance, symbol, and science rolled into one. It nourished the hungry, pleased the gods, bound communities, and spurred agriculture. It was both a gift and a necessity, a liquid thread stitching together the earliest chapters of civilization. It was liquid infrastructure, quietly building the foundation of the ancient world one swallow at a time. Long before gleaming breweries were mechanized and centuries before recipes were carefully inked onto parchment, beer was a domestic craft. And not just any domestic craft, it was a woman's domain. In many of the earliest cultures, brewing was not something monopolized by men in large workshops. It was a household art, intimately tied to the rhythms of daily life, and most often practiced by women. Far from being treated as a simple chore like sweeping a floor or stirring a pot, brewing was viewed as a highly skilled process bordering on sacred, one that mothers passed to daughters as though it were an heirloom richer than gold. Nowhere is this clearer than in ancient Sumer. For the Sumerians, beer and femininity were inseparable. The goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was a woman, and that was no symbolic ornament. It reflected lived reality. Sumerian women were the primary brewers responsible for making the drink that nourished both family and gods. In both households and temples, women controlled fermentation. Brewing was often paired with baking, since both relied on harnessing yeast and the mystery of fermentation. As men managed politics, warfare, and trade, women created the sustenance that allowed the entire machine of society to function. The story continues along the Nile. In ancient Egypt too, women were the dominant brewers, particularly within the home. Beer was produced in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain mixed with water and flavorings. The work was time-consuming but habitual. Many women brewed on a daily or weekly cycle, producing not just for their own households but also for markets and barter. Brewing became part of the economic lifeblood of communities, with women selling or trading their creations in busy town squares. In the estates of the wealthy, female servants often managed breweries of modest scale, ensuring the master's household was never short of the daily ration of liquid bread. Egyptian tomb paintings and hieroglyphs reveal this world with striking clarity. Images of women bent over vats, straining liquid and sealing jars, remind us that this was not incidental labor but central to life itself. Temples, too, were filled with the fragrance of brewing. Priestesses and temple workers produced sacred batches destined for offerings, rituals, and religious festivals. These brewers were not merely cooks. They were custodians of divine tradition, interpreters of the mysterious transformation of grain into elixir. To hold the role of brewer was in certain regions a source of status, a pathway to spiritual influence, and a means of participating directly in the maintenance of divine order. Over time, as city-states expanded, hierarchies solidified, and brewing grew more commercialized, men began to take control of large-scale beer production. But if we trace beer back to its earliest chapters, the story is unambiguously female. Women designed the methods, perfected the recipes, and safeguarded the knowledge. Their brewing sustained households, fueled temple rituals, and eventually underpinned economies. Echoes of this tradition lingered far into the medieval era. In Europe, the first professional brewers were often alewives, women who made and sold ale out of their homes. They sometimes wore tall hats so that buyers could spot them across crowded markets. This detail, later caricatured into the pointed hats of witches, began simply as a practical signal of trade. But in the ancient world, a woman with a brew pot was no figure of suspicion. She was respected. She was seen as the one who nourished mortals and gods alike, one bubbling jar at a time. Brewing, despite appearances, was never guesswork or magic. It was a craft steadily refined over generations, combining careful observation, trial and error, and environmental know-how. At its heart were four elements: grain, water, fermentation, and time. Yet within that simple formula, infinite variations blossomed. Barley was the chief grain of choice across Mesopotamia and much of the ancient Near East. In Egypt, emmer wheat also held pride of place. These grains were not chosen only for abundance, but also because they naturally carried the sugars and enzymes necessary for fermentation. Typically, grains were partially malted, soaked until they sprouted just slightly, then dried and ground or baked into loaves of bread made specifically for brewing. In both Sumer and Egypt, these special loaves were crumbled into large clay vats of water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes boiled, and then left to rest. Fermentation began invisibly, carried by wild yeast floating in the air or clinging to the walls of well-used vessels. Brewers may not have understood microbiology, but they knew that certain jars, paddles, or brewing houses made better beer. Those objects likely harbored colonies of yeast passed from one batch to the next. To enhance flavor, brewers sometimes added dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian brews in particular were known to be thick, sweet, and heavy, resembling drinkable porridge. Filtering was often skipped. Drinkers used long straws to avoid swallowing sediment, sipping liquid while the grains settled at the bottom. These beers were so nourishing that they often doubled as meals, especially for laborers and the poor. Climate influenced brewing just as much as ingredients. In hot lands like Mesopotamia and Egypt, careful timing was crucial. Brewing was often done in cooler courtyards, shaded enclosures, or underground storage pits to regulate temperature. Some beers were sealed in clay jars to age, while others were consumed fresh. Tools of the trade were simple but effective: ceramic vats, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and stone hearths. Each batch carried subtle differences, yet the craft endured because it was shared orally and ritually reinforced by repetition, prayer, and even song. The famous hymn to Ninkasi was not only a hymn but also an encoded recipe reminding brewers of their sacred role. These techniques, while ancient, were not primitive. They were sophisticated adaptations to environment, climate, and cultural taste. Brewing reflected not only culinary ingenuity, but also an intimate understanding of nature's rhythms. It was a kind of alchemy where grain and water, through time and mystery, became a sacred drink, binding households, temples, and empires. As brewing became indispensable, its influence spread far beyond hearth and altar. Beer was not just refreshment, it was an economic engine. In Mesopotamia, beer functioned as part of the ration system. Builders, farmers, scribes, and laborers received daily beer allowances as wages. The quality and amount of beer often reflected social standing. Higher-ranking officials enjoyed refined brews, while ordinary workers received thick, hearty varieties. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform detail these allocations, showing just how central beer was to economic life. Thousands of receipts and contracts confirm that beer was valued as highly as silver or grain. Breweries themselves became professional institutions, often linked to temples or estates. Large-scale production required an entire workforce: grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Certain regions became famous for particular brewing styles, establishing local identities and trade networks. Beer was carried in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth and exchanged for wool, olive oil, or pottery. Egypt mirrored this pattern on an even grander scale. State granaries maintained breweries to supply both urban populations and rural estates. Workers on monumental projects such as pyramids received beer as a staple part of their diet. Soldiers, priests, and officials too were sustained by state-distributed brews. Beer was taxed, tracked, and stockpiled as carefully as any strategic resource. When coinage was scarce, beer itself became a unit of barter. Archaeological finds prove that beer also traveled across borders. Residues of barley-based brews have been discovered in vessels from the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, demonstrating that beer moved along with other goods in long-distance trade. While wine eventually became the prestige drink of elites, beer remained the universal beverage fueling everyday life and underpinning entire economies. But beer was never socially neutral. It reflected and reinforced the hierarchies of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, everyday workers drank dense, unfiltered brews that were closer to stew than drink. These provided sustenance and hydration under the blazing sun. Yet written sources mention at least 9 distinct grades of beer, with the finer qualities reserved for priests, scribes, and administrators. Already beer was drawing lines between classes. Egypt took this contrast further. The poor consumed coarse beer brewed from emmer wheat, often flavored with dates. The wealthy sipped lighter, sweeter, filtered varieties, sometimes served in elegant goblets. Tomb paintings show nobles reclining beneath palms while servants poured golden beer into jars. For the elite, beer was not merely survival, it was a cultivated pleasure, a marker of refinement. Pharaohs received daily offerings of beer alongside bread and wine. These rituals symbolized not only piety but also wealth and authority. Only the privileged could afford teams of servants to brew with the finest ingredients. Beer also entered the political sphere. Sharing high-quality beer at feasts or during treaties signaled status and respect. Failing to provide beer could be taken as an insult. Temples brewed vast quantities not only for gods but also for state functions. Professionally trained brewers operated in these settings, ensuring uniformity and quality. Thus, beer, though universal, carried many meanings. To some, it was calories and hydration, a lifeline for survival. To others, it was ceremony, leisure, or political currency. The liquid bread of the ancient world nourished peasants and pharaohs alike, but not in the same way. Behind every sip stood a complex web of labor, ritual, and hierarchy. In truth, beer was not only drunk, it was counted, traded, blessed, and weaponized. It fed workers, enriched temples, and sustained empires. A simple mug could contain the story of civilization itself. For many people in the ancient world, beer was more than a drink. It could be a symbol of refinement, a demonstration of wealth, or even an expression of the divine. Each jar of beer carried with it not only a unique flavor but also a subtle reflection of social status rising in the foam at the rim of the vessel. Thousands of years may separate us from the Sumerian priestesses who sang hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, or the Egyptian laborers who refreshed themselves with beer in the shadow of the pyramids, yet their legacy lingers. Beer still connects us through recipes, rituals, economies, and cultural memory to some of the earliest expressions of civilization itself. Modern brewing owes an immense debt to those ancient innovators. Many of the processes we now consider basic, such as malting grain, allowing natural yeast to ferment a mixture, or enhancing flavor with fruits, herbs, and honey, were all discovered long before anyone had microscopes or thermometers. These early brewers relied instead on sharp observation, inherited traditions, and careful experimentation, blending trial and error with ritual prayer. Knowledge was passed down orally, often embedded in songs or sacred texts. What they built was not accidental. It was a foundation that centuries later would blossom into scientific brewing, yet it began with ordinary hands in kitchens and temples, and this spirit has not disappeared. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, or rural regions of Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in clay vessels using recipes passed down through countless generations. These living traditions echo the methods of Sumerian and Egyptian women who once oversaw fermentation in their own households. Brewing in these societies is not just a pastime or a business transaction. It remains a social ritual, a way to bind families and neighbors together much as it did thousands of years ago. The symbolic meaning of beer has endured as well. Festivals, seasonal gatherings, and holidays across the world continue to feature beer as a centerpiece of celebration. From massive Oktoberfest tents to the humbler pint at a corner pub, beer has retained its role as a drink of bonding and identity. To share beer is to share fellowship, just as the Sumerians once sipped from communal clay pots using reed straws. Beer has always been a bridge between people, dissolving distance and difference, if only for the length of a cup. In modern times, even science has turned its attention to this heritage. A growing discipline known as bioarchaeology has uncovered traces of ancient brewing practices. Through residue analysis, researchers have reconstructed recipes thousands of years old, sometimes even producing small batches of these brews for modern consumption. Projects in experimental archaeology have successfully recreated beers based on Egyptian tomb instructions, giving today's drinkers a literal taste of antiquity. It is both scholarship and sensory experience, a way of stepping back into the past with every sip. What these stories reveal is profound. Civilization was never built solely on monuments, armies, or inventions of steel. It was also built in kitchens and courtyards, in the careful rhythm of fermentation, in the jars tended by women and workers who transformed grain and water into sustenance. Beer was consumed by the masses, offered to the gods, and used to pay wages. It was as much a cornerstone of society as stone or bronze. So the next time you raise your glass, take a moment to think beyond the bubbles. You are not only enjoying a modern beverage, you are participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal traditions, one that has been brewing for millennia and continues to ferment today in every corner of the globe. It is a legacy that belongs to all of us, an unbroken chain of nourishment, community, and culture poured one cup at a time.